Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Geology 109, Evolution of the Earth. This is week 3, and the topic that we're going to be discussing in the lecture this week is evolution. And there's something I want to show you. This is a cast of the tooth of Tyrannosaurus Rex. Now, to be fair, this is what would have been sticking out of the mouth, and the rest of it is root that would have been stuck up into the maxilla, the upper jawbone of the animal. T-Rex was about 40 feet long, weighed anywhere estimates from 6 to 8 tons. Its skull is about 4 feet long. The most massive terrestrial predator that we know of in Earth's history. And today, its lineage is represented by some of the smallest vertebrates on land, things like hummingbirds, sparrows. All of our modern birds are living groups of dinosaurs. When I was an undergrad student, we used to say things like birds are descended from dinosaurs. Now we actually realize they're a type of dinosaur the same way humans are a type of primate. Or dogs are a type of canid. They're from the same lineage that gave us, wolves and coyotes. Evolution is a really powerful force of nature. Over millions of years, countless generations, it shapes and forms living things and populations from one set of characteristics to the next. And we can't really discuss the history of life on this planet and the role that it plays in the planet's evolution without understanding biological evolution. So that's what we're going to be talking about this week in Geology 109. We're going to be looking at evolution, which some call the greatest show on Earth. Before we really get into the nuts and bolts of biological evolution, I have a couple of points and a couple of things I want to point out first, just to make sure we're all on the same page. First and foremost, I have no desire to force anybody to question any strong felt personal, spiritual, or religious beliefs. That all being said, evolution is not a belief system. It's a scientific concept. It is supported by evidence. It is reproducible. It has no role in defining religion or religious beliefs. If your understanding of evolution causes you to wrestle with personal preconceived notions, that's on you. I'm happy to be an ear if you want to talk about it, of course, but that's not my goal, is to convert anybody. It's a science course. It's a scientific concept. That all being said, evolution is a theory, and that word theory is really misused in the way that we talk about things in common dialogue, in colloquial discussions. We use the word theory when we actually mean something else. In theory, actually, is an explanation. Theory is as good as you get in science. For example, the concept of what happens when you split an atom is theoretical, but we're all pretty sure what happens because we've done it, and it's devastating. Finally, there is a lot of contention about evolution, especially in the United States, but it's not really among scientists or scientific organizations. As I said earlier in this lecture, scientists debate modes and rates of evolution, but they're kind of done testing whether or not it's a thing that happens. We're pretty sure it is. We've seen it. You can reproduce it in a lab on what we call a microevolutionary scale, or on a broader scale with the fossil record, we call macroevolution. Okay, so the chatter you hear about, is evolution a thing or not, is not something that scientists are actually debating anymore, because we have such overwhelming evidence that yes, it is. We can experience it and observe it directly. I also want to talk about some basic definitions to use, I guess, just in scientific discussions in general. And this does feed a bit off of the last slide. First of all, a fact. A fact is an observation that's been repeatedly confirmed. So if you lift up a pencil and you let go of it, it will fall on the table or fall on the ground. That's a fact. You can observe that, and you can do it over and over and over again to confirm that on Earth, under these conditions, if you pick something up and let go of it, it will fall. Okay? Those are facts. Facts are data. There's things you collect and observe. A law is how you would generalize a common phenomenon of facts. So for example, I could drop a pencil 100 times and it does the same thing every time. So I could demonstrate that to somebody by doing it another 100 times, or I can kind of combine my results and say, here's a law. It's a descriptive generalization about how the physical world behaves. In this case, it would be, when I lift up a pencil and let it go, it falls. I've done this a bunch of times. That's the law, right? So in the scientific term, law is a descriptive generalization kind of summarizing the phenomenon of your facts. But that doesn't explain the how and why that phenomenon occurs, that law occurs. And this is where hypotheses come in. You may have heard of hypotheses as educated guesses, and that's really not a very accurate description of a hypothesis. Hypothesis is a testable statement that we use to build inferences and explanations. So it's not just an educated guess. It is educated in the form of you have to have some background knowledge of the phenomenon you're testing, but it's an attempt to figure out an explanation, okay, to explain the how and the why. And if you test an hypothesis and it is rejected, it doesn't work, then you go back and you develop a new hypothesis based on that experience. But what if it is confirmed? What if your hypothesis can't be disproven because every single test confirms it? Then it elevates to a theory, which is as good as you get in science. A theory is a well-substantiated explanation. It incorporates facts, laws, inferences, and the results of positive tested hypotheses. So gravity, for example, is a phenomenon. You can drop a pencil 100,000 times and it keeps falling. Those are facts. We can summarize that into a law of what goes up must come down. But why? And that's where we start getting into gravitational theory about the relationship of mass and so on. Okay. So when we use theory, we mean it. You might do something, and I've heard people do this, putzing around trying to fix a car, and they'll say something like, well, in theory, this repair should fix everything. Really what they mean is hypothetically. A theory wouldn't make any sense there. Okay? So what is evolution? The word evolution just kind of means change over time. And hell, we could be talking about the evolution of the iPhone, right? But what we're talking about here is with animals. And there's a reason I have a finch and a tortoise on this slide. The kind of evolution that we're referring to, we also call organic or biological evolution, because we want to be able to distinguish it from discussions on, smartphones. The working definition of evolution, though, is the progressive change in populations of organisms over time. And I want to point out that I've italicized populations because it's important. We've already talked about ontogeny. Remember, that's how an individual organism grows. You, all of you listening or watching, have experienced ontogeny. You've grown and your physical form has changed during growth. But you haven't changed species from juvenile to adulthood. Animals, individual organisms, whether it's animals or plants, do not evolve. Their populations do. It's the same thing if you looked outside and noted on the weather. The weather is the atmospheric conditions at a single location at a single moment in time. Weather changes, right? You wouldn't look out the window and say, oh, it's 65 degrees and sunny outside. It is always 65 degrees and sunny outside, because that's not the case, especially in Wisconsin. So populations are averages, right, over time. Same way that climate would be a discussion of, here's the average type of atmospheric conditions over a period of time. Talking about evolution being a change in populations and not individuals is the difference between like evolution and ontogeny. You all undergo ontogenetic change, but nobody biologically evolves from one species to another. Populations do. So the biological definition of evolution is, and we're going to break down the sentence, don't worry, the change in the frequency of alleles within a gene pool from one generation to the next. Okay, so let's break that down. Anybody know what an allele is? An allele is a genetic trait. So it's the change in the frequency or how often genetic traits are passed from one generation to the next and expressed. Okay. So, for example, if you were to go on a nice trip to Europe and you were going to tour a bunch of castles in Europe, one thing that people note, especially today, especially Americans, when we go over there and we look at the castles, we're like, the beds are really small compared to today, and the doorways are small compared to today. And that's because people were a little bit shorter on average in those areas back then. Okay, that was the average height. The average height has changed from one location to another over time. Okay, similar to what we have going on here, the modern definition. What does that actually mean? Evolution is a change in the number of times that certain genes for certain characteristics occur within an interbreeding population. Okay, so it's the number of times that characteristics show up in a population that is able to reproduce. Okay, individuals don't evolve, populations do. Okay, individuals go through ontogeny. Populations over time go through biological evolution. And I want to point out that there is no implied improvement in evolution. It's progressive, it's ongoing, but it's not always perfect improvement. I had somebody ask once, when will we have the perfect organism, the perfectly evolved organism? I said, never, because it's a constant arms race. If you take a polar bear, white fur, it lives in a snow and ice covered environment, it blends in. It's a good match. Its genes, or polar bear in general, genes, work really well for the environment they're living in. But if all of a sudden that snow and ice were to melt, now polar bears wouldn't be camouflaged. They'd stick out like a sore thumb among the background. So there is no implied improvement. It's just being able to keep up with the environment and change with it. That's what populations do. So another misconception about evolution is that organisms change because they want to. And we call that Lamarkian evolution because the first person to come up with the concept or coin the term evolution was Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. And Lamarck actually was right in the idea that populations change over time, but he thought it was because they want to. So for example, he said, well, giraffes have long necks because in the past giraffes had short necks and they stretched taller and taller from one generation to the next until their necks were long enough to reach those leaves. And that doesn't work because that's the equivalent of saying that if I accidentally were to lose a limb in an accident, that my kids would be born without that limb. And that's not true. That doesn't happen. Okay. And do you remember before when I talked about microevolution, which we can see in the lab on the short scale, and macroevolution, which is what we see in the fossil record? Microevolution would be changes seasonally with flu vaccines, for example. You need a different flu vaccine every year because that virus mutates over time. So microevolutionary changes. Macroevolution would be what would happen if you scale that up over millions of years. So there's really no big difference between macro and microevolution. Macroevolution is kind of a scaled up collection of microevolutionary events. Okay. So just to kind of get these nuts and bolts out of the way for evolution, just to kind of get some of those misconceptions out of the way. What I want to do now, though, is talk about somebody who's given a lot of credit, I'm not saying he's not due, into the concept of evolution, but I want to clarify some more things. We're going to talk a little bit about Charles Darwin. Darwin is kind of synonymous when you say evolution. It's a thought that pops into your head, it's usually the old version of Darwin. But contrary to popular belief, Darwin was not the first person to describe the concept of evolution. His grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a supporter of Lamarkian evolution. What Darwin did is continue that research and actually found the mechanism that drives evolution, at least part the way. He got part the way there. Another thing I find interesting, just personally, about Darwin is that he was born February 12, 1809 in Shrewsbury, England, the same year, same day as Abraham Lincoln in the United States. So two people born under the exact same date and went on to make huge changes to the worlds in which they were inhabiting. So what do we know about Darwin? Well, we know that Darwin sailed on the Beagle, the HMS Beagle, from 1831 to 1836. So they left in 1831 from England. They went down through the Falkland Islands in South America, up to the equatorial Galapagos in 1835, and then around Australia, and then up from South Africa, and then back up to England. So about a 5-year trip, and he served as the naturalist on board of this science expedition. But I want to clarify some things. Darwin wasn't hired because he was a brilliant scientist. Darwin got on board of this ship as the captain's essentially first mate crew in a way. He was a naturalist on board, but his job was to pretty much to hang out with the captain, because the captain of the ship wasn't allowed to fraternize with the crew. So it wasn't uncommon back then for these long voyages for somebody to be on board to just kind of hang out with the captain, have dinner with him, have a few drinks, play cards or whatever. Because Darwin wasn't doing anything else at the time. He was a college student, he wanted to be a physician, but he really was not a very good student. So he didn't go to class much and ultimately dropped out. And so he moved back home, and his parents said, no, this isn't going to work. You're either going to go find a job or we're going to send you to the seminary to be a priest. And so he jumped on board of this ship to be the captain's buddy, and he did like nature and science, so he thought, oh, this is a cool opportunity. And that's kind of how Darwin got involved in all this. It was really because he didn't want to become a priest. But the things that he observed on that trip really changed the way that we think about nature and evolution today. They would stop at places like the Falkland Islands or the Galapagos, and Darwin would get off the boat and he'd collect little samples of rocks and minerals and fossils and modern animals and plants, and he'd write little descriptions, and then he'd have those papers sent back to England to be published in journals when they'd come across a mailing vessel. So the observations that he made for his ideas, a lot of them started on this voyage. And the Galapagos Islands are a very important part of this, because what Darwin noticed when he was there, you got all these little volcanic islands close together right off the western coast of South America, is there's finches on all the islands, and there were tortoises on the islands, and he noticed that they look very different from each other, especially in terms of what they're eating. So the finches that have the long skinny beaks usually eat bugs out of termite holes and trees, or the ones that have really, really robust beaks usually eat seeds and nuts, but they all kind of share a number of similarities as well. So he started collecting samples and collecting data on this. And he presumed that populations of these finches and other organisms would change over time. And in 1844, he developed the concept of the driving force of evolution. But I want to point out that he did not publish these ideas until many, many years later, until 1859. And in his book, Origin of Species, Darwin writes, I have called this principle by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved by the term natural selection. And this is one of my favorite images of all time. This is a photograph of Darwin's actual notebook that he was using when he was coming up with this idea in the 1840s. And what you see there doodled in the margin is one of the first evolutionary trees Darwin ever wrote. And I particularly liked it up in the corner are the words, I think. Like he's thinking out this idea. And ultimately ended up completely changing the way that we view biology, paleontology, and time. So what is natural selection? Well, it's based on two observations and a couple of inferences. And I want to point out that inferences are not wild guesses. Inferences are when you have situation A, which leads to situation B, and with evidence you can infer the end result. So the first observation that Darwin noted, both with finches and with plants and animals that he continued to study for many years at home, when he got back from this voyage and started a family, is that organisms in nature generally have more offspring than can survive to adulthood. Now, you could think of examples where this is not the case, such as with apes. They usually don't have a whole bunch of offspring at once. But think about dogs, cats, fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds. Most of them have multiple offsprings at once. They'll lay a lot of eggs, or they'll have a lot of babies. And the reality is that most of those, or not all of them, will make it to adulthood. I once was doing some research down in Florida and took a trip to the Everglades, and we were just observing the frequency of running into alligators while we were there and getting some estimates on how big they were. And you did see big 8 to 12 foot alligators, but they weren't nearly the most abundant. The most abundant alligators we saw were about 3 or 4 feet long. They weren't full grown. Most of them would not make it to adulthood. They're going to be outcompeted for something, or they're going to be eaten by something bigger. The second observation is that of these offspring, most of them are not identical, even if they have the same parents. So think of your own situations. If you have a sibling from the same set of parents, whether they're the same sex and gender or not, like your sibling, your characteristics, you probably have some characteristics you share with a brother or a sister. But then there's characteristics that are just more yours, okay? Because if you think about how genetics are passed down, it's kind of like, if you took a deck of cards and you separated out the red cards from the black cards, you got half of that deck from your mom, half of that deck from your dad, and they get shuffled together. And that resulting pattern is your genetic code. Your siblings, same 2 decks of cards, but they shuffle together differently. So they have their own genetic code. Okay, so there's variation. If I could see the faces of everybody in this class, I guarantee everybody's going to look slightly different. Okay, because offspring are not identical. There's variation in their appearance, their size, and all sorts of these different characteristics. So let's take these 2 observations together. Organisms have more offspring than are going to survive to adulthood in nature, and none of those offspring are usually identical. There's variation. So from these 2 observations, we can make a very important inference, which is those organisms that have characteristics that work better in their environment are going to be the ones that have a slightly better chance of surviving to adulthood, reproducing, and passing those characteristics on to their offspring. Okay, so if we have a population of bears, and they're all brown, but some of them have different shades of brown. Okay, so variation within a population. And you have a couple of bears that have a very bizarre genetic characteristic where they have white fur. Now, in a normal environment, that's not going to be beneficial to them. So they are not going to have a good chance of being healthy and eating more and reproducing and passing that characteristic on. But if you take that bear and you put it into a tundra or frozen environment, now it's a better fit for that environment than the brown bears are. This white bear is going to be able to blend in, to camouflage, to sneak up on its prey easier, to eat better, to be healthier, and thus pass those on when it reproduces. Now, is any of this a guarantee? Absolutely not. But what it does do is it kind of gives us some probability. Which things are going to have the better chance, the better likelihood? Or, as it's been sometimes called, survival of the fittest. But remember, fitness always depends on time and place. Because just as my example with the polar bears, if you take a polar bear and put it in a place where there's no snow, its advantage is gone. Its privilege is gone. If you take a brown bear and put it in the tundra, its advantage is gone. So we have organisms that work in their environments, and the environments help kind of select for those characteristics. So going back to our Darwinian concept of evolution, the Darwinian model, unlike the Lamarck one, we had giraffe in the past with a variety of different neck shapes and sizes. The ones that had the taller necks could eat better because they could reach more vegetation, so thus they had a better chance of surviving and passing that long neck characteristic on to their offspring. And that is natural selection, that the environment at the time and its characteristics of that ecosystem help filter out characteristics in the organisms that are living within it. Now, the fossil record plays a really important aspect in this because the fossil record gives us the time context for evolution. We can look at bacterial strains in labs and see how they evolve in populations and change in just a matter of days. That's microevolution. But if we want to see macroevolution, we have to look at the changes we see in fossils throughout the strata, throughout the rocks, over millions of years. It's kind of an instant replay of macroevolution, but over millions and millions of years. Now, how do we tell one species from another, though? Well, there's really 2 different ways that we can do this. First, we can look at the morphology, the shape. This could be the general shape of the body or shape of parts, such as bones and skeletal tissue. The other thing we can do with extant or living organisms is look at their genetic code. And by having these two different methods, what we can do is test one another. We can take two genetic samples from living animals today, and we can compare their genes and figure out genetically how closely related they are and how different they are. We can also then look at their anatomy and their skeletal structure and see how closely they seem related based on that. And if they both match, then that's a pretty good sign that you're on the right track. Fossils, though, are a different story, because fossils are what we get more, we get our morphology from fossils, but it's only a partial morphology. Remember, we're just looking at the hard parts. We can't compare soft tissues on fossils where the soft tissues aren't preserved. So while the fossil record doesn't give us the genetic information, usually, it does give us something that modern animals can't give us, and that is a time stratigraphic context, meaning a context of where these things existed in time, how many millions of years ago. Your soft tissue comparisons and genetic codes can't do that, but finding them in rocks that are datable to certain ages can help us determine that aspect about life, which modern animals can't provide. So I want to talk a bit about principles and evidence of evolution, and I'm going to do so over these four main points: phylogeny, homology, speciation, diversity and disparity, and then homeomorphs. Phylogeny is where we're going to start, and that is your evolutionary family tree. So it's a lineage. Phylogeny is a lineage. It's very similar to genealogy, except we're looking at it in terms of species and evolution and not aunts, uncles, cousins, and grandparents. All life on Earth is genetically related, meaning we have countless branches on a single tree, and the base of that tree is a common ancestor. So if you look at the diversification of all major groups of life on the planet, we are right there. And by the way, that's just mammals. So you can see that there's groups in groups in groups, right? It's like those nested Russian dolls where you have a group inside a larger group. But we are just one tiny branch off of this huge timeless tree that's been growing, you can say, for about 4 billion years. So a phylogeny is your evolutionary family tree, but we need to learn how to discuss the details of that tree. So let's go back and talk a little bit about our cladistics or phylogenies. So why we call it cladistics is because we're dealing with a group called a clade. A clade is any group of organisms that share a common ancestor. So, for example, wolves, coyotes, dogs, and foxes would make up a clade of what we call canids, and they share a common ancestor that's no longer alive. Sometime in the distant past, wolves, foxes, dogs, and coyotes had a common ancestor that looked not really exactly like any of them, but shared some characteristics with all of them. And then over time, when that went extinct, its offspring branched into a different direction. So as we look at this series of trees, we can see that our clades can be an individual branch or could be a group of branches, but they have to have a common ancestor. A grade would be a group of organisms that are similar, but not necessarily a clade. They're excluding certain members. So we can look at the stratophenotypic phylogeny of the horned dinosaurs, not just Triceratops, where we can see the trees and the branches and the groups. So for example, we can see that this particular group of ceratopsians or horned dinosaurs share a common ancestor at this point, where there's a branch going here and a branch going here. Okay, there's another branch here that goes that way, and so on. And this is actually telling us which ones are older and which ones are younger. So not only is this telling us the evolutionary relationships, but it is imprinted over a geologic timescale to show us which ones are relatively older or younger than others. So now we can actually trace evolution over time. You can't do this with living organisms because you need to know how old these different things are. We can look at it from a much larger perspective, looking at archosaurs in general. We have our non-dinosaurian reptiles like crocodiles. And then we have this node here, which branches to dinosaurs and non-avian dinosaurs. So this is the common ancestor to both. Okay. And what are they characterized by? Well, they have a couple of evolutionary novelties. For example, they both walk upright in their posture, unlike lizards and crocodiles. And we can do the same thing with something like other kinds of animals. So here's a trout, a horse, and a whale. Well, a horse and a whale share a common ancestor, B, but all three of them share a common ancestor, A. Ancestor A would have been pretty much a less evolved fish than a trout. Ancestor B is a tetrapod, but there's been a lot of changes that have happened in between that original tetrapod and then horses and whales. So another way of showing this cladogram is more into a phylogenetic tree, where we have branches that are a little more squared off. So we can see that horses and whales are in a group together, and fish are in a group by themselves, and they together make up one very, very large group of just animals. Now, what is homology? Homology is the evidence for these types of evolutionary relationships, and it's based on shared derived characteristics you got from a common ancestor and you share them with others. So for example, we have 4 different limbs shown on the screen. We have a whale, we have a cat, a bat, and a gorilla. Now, these are all mammals, but they live in very different places. Whales swim, cats run and sometimes climb, bats fly, and gorillas can climb, but they're not great at running. So despite their totally different ways of using these limbs, notice something about their skeletal structure. In purple, they all have a humerus bone. Now, that humerus might be shaped a little differently, but notice just below the humerus you have 2 blue bones, the radius and the ulna, in every single case. And below that you have a series of green wrist bones, or green in this diagram. And below that you have the finger bones, the phalanges, which are outlined in red. Now, whales and bats look somewhat similar, pretty different. The whale bones are a lot more squat and robust than the bat ones, but notice they both have evolved a hand that's more for moving through some kind of medium like air or water. Swimming and flying use some of the same physics. Notice that the gorilla walks on its fingers, but it has really, really long fingers compared to its hand size, so it can manipulate and grasp things. And cats have modified their radius, ulna, and their hand for running. So if these 4 organisms were not related, why do they all have the same bones, but just with their own version and spin on them? Okay, so that's what homology is. It's shared derived character. So all 4 of these have a shared ancestor that had these 4 bones, but they looked a little bit different. And that's because evolution is constrained by what we call a bow plan. It's another term for an architectural drawing, which is a bit tongue-in-cheek. But the bow plan pretty much states that you're not going to have an offspring that suddenly has, anatomical features that are totally, totally different than the parents, because you got these from your parents. You got the genes from your parents, who got the genes from their parents, and so on, going back millions and millions of years. Another way of just thinking about homology is it is a new design by modifying so-called old parts. And we can look at this just in terms of general relationships. We have a wolf, a coyote, and a frog. Now, the wolf and the coyote are closely related to each other. Their genes show they're more closely related to each other. Their phylogeny shows they're more closely related to each other. Neither one is more or less related to the frog, though. They are distantly related to the frog in the fact that they all have 4 limbs with 5 digits. They're all tetrapods, but the wolf and the coyote share an ancestor that is more recent. Okay, so they all have a common ancestor. The wolf and the coyote have a separate common ancestor that is more recent than that group's, the canid group, and how it's related to the frog. And we call that the shared derived characteristics. Now, how do we get a new species? How do we get a new branch on our phylogenetic tree? Well, this is a process known as speciation. And species don't just derive out of nothing. You have one species and it branches off into a new lineage. So it's a new species that is split off from an existing lineage. Microevolutionary changes, those tiny little day-to-day, generation-to-generation changes that populations see, those kind of collectively culminate into these larger, over time, macroevolutionary changes. So for example, we start out with species A, and species A exists and persists through some period of time. But at some point in that history, there's a subset of that population that is born with a series of different characteristics, and that would be species B. And that coexists in time parallel to species A until ultimately, for whatever reason, species B goes extinct and maybe species A continues. But it's a branch off of an existing lineage. So let's say we start out with species A and it exists for some time. At one point, we get a branch off of that that produces a different population that's related. This would be species B. And then we have yet another one later on, that's species C, and then maybe species D. Okay. So at one period of time, we have A, B, C, and D all living at the same time. We would call that peak diversity and abundance. That's when we have the most species of a group all present at the same time. So high diversity. However, if three of those, B, C, and D, all go extinct shortly afterwards, we would call that a mass extinction. And maybe species A does continue, but not in the thriving amounts that it once was. Whenever you see a dotted line like that on one of these types of phylogenetic trees, that indicates what we call localized survival in refugia. That would mean back in the time when B, C, and D were speciating off of A, it was all over the place. A was found everywhere in great abundance. But after the mass extinction event, it's reduced down to just small populations. I want to talk a little bit about homeomorphs or convergent evolution. Now, we have three different types of animals portrayed on the screen. We have a shark, we have a dolphin, and then this really weird looking thing. That's an ichthyosaur. That is an extinct reptile, aquatic reptile from the Jurassic period. So what do we know about these? Well, we know sharks are a type of fish and they're predatory. We know dolphins are a mammal that lives in the water and it is also predatory. And we know that ichthyosaurs are reptiles and were predatory and lived in the water. What else do we know about these three? Well, they all have a pointed face. They all have a dorsal fin. They all have pectoral fins. They all have a tail fin. They all are aquatic predators. But one's a fish, one's a mammal, and one is a reptile. So they didn't acquire these characteristics from a common ancestor. This is not homology. Instead, these three organisms evolved these aquatic predatory characteristics independently. Sharks are a type of fish. Dolphins came from a land animal that developed an aquatic lifestyle, and ichthyosaurs evolved from a terrestrial animal, a terrestrial reptile, that then evolved more for aquatic predatory as well. So they all share characteristics, but they're not derived. This is the opposite of homology, where they look the same, but under the hood, they're very, very different. Okay. For example, the tail fin of a dolphin is derived from its limbs. Sharks have a tail fin that doesn't derive from limbs because they never had limbs to begin with. So function constrains the form. The reason why these three have some very similar looking shapes and outlines, like if you were to do a drawing of these three, they'd probably look pretty similar, is because this is a really good shape to have if you are an aquatic predator. And that's convergent evolution. It's two unrelated organisms having similar looking characteristics because they're doing something similar in life in their environment. So convergent evolution happens in nature because the shape that we're looking at works really well for that type of condition and lifestyle. If it didn't work, we would see extinction. And that's what I want to finish up on today, are extinctions. And let's start with a little bit of a thought concept. So, if over time there have been about 50 billion different types of species that have lived on Earth over the last 4 billion years. And today we have about 50 million species alive. That means 99%, 99.9% of all species that have ever lived are extinct. Now, if somebody told you that 99.9% of all of your savings in your bank account was gone, you'd probably say, oh, I'm broke. They took it all, pretty much. And therefore, at first approximation, all species that have ever existed are now extinct. And this was a thought concept that was promoted by biologist David Ropp, who studies extinctions. And extinctions are very important because this is the geologic timescale, going from the beginning of our planet's history in the Precambrian, going to today, or right before today, in what we call the Pleistocene. We live in an epoch called the Holocene. So this timescale is actually based on fossil extinctions. Notice we have 3 eras, the Paleozoic, Mesozoic, and Cenozoic. And those eras are made up of periods, such as the Permian, the Triassic, the Cretaceous, and the Paleocene. The boundaries between the Paleozoic and the Mesozoic, or the Permian and the Triassic, is because of a mass extinction. When we look in the geologic record, we see fossils that compose up what we call the Permian, and we see fossils that compose what we call the Triassic, but they're incredibly different. So at the end of the Permian, we have a mass extinction. At the end of the Cretaceous, we have a mass extinction. And that's why we have different eras, because those are the 2 biggest mass extinctions our planet's ever seen, is at the end of the Permian and at the end of the Cretaceous. So our eras are characterized by very different fossil faunas. The extinction of these major groups is followed by diversification of new organisms and niche replacement. So after a bunch of the Permian animals went extinct, they were replaced by new forms in the Triassic that exploited those niches. And at the end of the Cretaceous, a lot of things that went extinct, those niches were replaced by organisms from the Paleocene. The extinctions mark the boundary. Technically, every single period, Cambrian, Ordovician, Silurian, Devonian, and so on, are divided by changes in the fossil record, but the bigger the change, the bigger the boundary. Okay. Most species will only last just a few million years before extinction anyway. So when we look at what causes extinction, it's really quite variable. So why do species go extinct? Well, we have what we call the Darwinian assumption rule, because based on the concepts of natural selection, where your characteristics are a good fit for the environment at that place at that time, if that population is unable to adapt or compete, that's prime for extinction. Ultimately, though, there's lots of reasons. It could be out-hunted, it could be habitat loss, it could be just competition with something that's better at eating the same food source you are. There are some historical extinctions, like we know how the Carolina parakeet, the dodo, the thylacine, the passenger pigeon, and so on went extinct. We know that was, because of human interaction. But a lot of these are just because of causes that happen, changes in the environment, and not able to keep up. But there's also been some other things like asteroid impacts that have played a major role as well. Throughout the Earth's history, there have been at least 5 major mass extinctions, and these are listed in order of severity, not in order of time. The most severe is the Permo-Triassic extinction, approximately 248 to 250 million years ago. So that would be here. This boundary is the Permo-Triassic. The next one is the Cretaceous Tertiary, or Cretaceous Paleocene boundary, about 65 million years ago. We also have the late Devonian extinctions. These are interesting because it's not a single extinction. It's actually a series of them, but they're very closely clustered together. The end of the Ordovician extinction is one that is notable, and then the end of the Triassic. Notice that our Devonian, Ordovician, and Triassic extinctions do not start new eras. That's because they are relatively minor, but they are notable for still being mass extinctions. There's also some other significant extinction events. One here at the very end of the Pleistocene. This is what killed off most of our megafauna, like woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, cave bears, saber-toothed cats, dire wolves. All of our Ice Age mammals went extinct at that point. And again, that was exclusive to North America, which is kind of interesting. And then we also have the Eocene-Oligocene boundary about 38 million years ago. And this one we know is mostly climate driven, because in the Eocene it's very, very warm and tropical. In the Oligocene things start to dry out. We get more grasslands. So these are notable extinctions. And we'll talk more about the Cretaceous extinction as we get later on into the semester. We'll talk a bit more about the Permo-Triassic, which is known as the Great Dying. We're talking 90% of life went extinct in a very short period of time. For any upcoming exam, I'm not going to be holding you to memorizing the 5 major mass extinctions, but I do want you to know that there have been 5, and we will talk more about them as we go through the semester. And that concludes our week's discussion, this time on evolution. Don't purge all this information from your brains quite yet, because we still will be talking about the role of evolution in changes in populations of life over the entire history of the planet, especially after the first exam, which is coming up next week after our lecture on time, relative and absolute age dating, and the stratigraphic record. So until next time, I will see you in lab in a couple of weeks, and I will have the next lecture video out shortly as we prepare for our first exam, and more details on that coming up next week. Have a good one.